Hello and welcome to AXSChat. I'm delighted to welcome Ski today. Al has a book out and a hashtag which is Power of Disability. He was the co-founder of Planned Lifetime Advocacy Network. So Al, welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, how you came to work in the space, and how Debra describes you as someone that is separated from her at birth?
Well, thanks for having me on. And where I am, you got me up earlier than usual, so maybe I'll have a good day. um, so a little bit about my background. I would consider my profession to be a community organizer, and so worked for years and years and years in communities that were dealing with exclusion or poverty or homelessness. And then 40 years ago or so, my second daughter was born. Her name is Liz. And she, as she describes it, her disability is rad. Her Down syndrome is rad. And that plunged me into a whole new world. And I very, very quickly figured out how to apply whatever skills I had as a community organizer into the disability world. So I don't know how much further you want me to go, but I spent a lot of time here in Canada closing big institutions, closing segregated schools, suing government, protesting.
Yeah, we want to know about that. We want to know about you closing the schools and suing because it's these kind of things that change the society that we live in, right? And it takes advocates and people with passion to drive this through.
I mean, this goes back the early 80s for me, and things are a lot different now. They're not anywhere close to what they should be, but they're a whole lot better. But in my home province of British Columbia in Canada, we had three big institutions, and we had segregated schools where all kids with disabilities, particularly those with a developmental or intellectual disability, were put. And if they weren't there, they were in segregated classes in school, segregated workshops, all of that kind of stuff. So in order to change that, we couldn't nudge it. We had to become protesters. And so I became the executive director of a pretty middle-class organization, and we turned ourselves into a pretty effective activist organization and blocked roads and did all those other things that I mentioned, and got all those things closed. But the big but, and maybe this is where it unites me with Debra, is that old habits die hard, and habits reveal or betray attitudes and beliefs and values about disabled people that don't go away just because people are living in the community now. And that's been a lifelong preoccupation with me, is how do you deal with what I like to call the cultural determinants of change, that they drag anchor on all the advances. And that's where we are today. It's one of the reasons I wrote my book, and I think it's what compels, Debra to do what she does, and why we instantly recognize each other.
I agree, Al. I agree. And I remember when the doctors told us that Sarah had Down syndrome, we weren't told at birth, which is unusual. You're usually told before you give birth or right at birth, and we were not told until Sarah was 4 months old. And so we already knew this baby, and when we were told, it was such a tragedy. And then I start looking around for data, and everything is so dark and gloomy, and the predictions for this little baby's life, and I just didn't even understand, why is her life a tragedy? It's not. And you and I was blessed to have you on my show, Human Potential at Work, and we talked a little bit about this, but I remember wanting to be a champion for my children, obviously, and certainly for my daughter born with Down syndrome, but I also wanted to give back to the community. This is my community. But I will tell you, I got a chilly reception coming into the field because I was a parent. And I thought, well, but shouldn't I, my goodness, if parents aren't allies, now I turn out to also be an individual with disabilities, like most human beings. And turns out that my husband is aged into a very, very serious disability. I didn't even realize, I remember when my daughter, when they told me she had Down syndrome, and I blurted out, something very intelligent. Well, I'm not telling my mom, just because my mother, who is deceased, and I love my mother so much, but my mother had borderline personality disorder. And when I did tell my mom asked me if I took drugs during my pregnancy, which, just for anybody that's curious, no, didn't take drugs. And by the way, taking drugs during your pregnancy doesn't cause Down syndrome. We don't know as a society what causes Down syndrome, but I still believe my daughter's life is not a tragedy. I believe your daughter's life is not a tragedy. I believe my life is not a tragedy. So really understanding, and we talk about this on this show and on other shows, about the power, once again, the power of humanity, the power of, being human, as your book is, and, talks about the power of disability, because disability is a very normal, very natural part of being a human being. And I think we should really embrace being that. And I know Neil was the first one I heard say, I'm going to come out as an individual with disabilities, with invisible disabilities, using the same terminologies that we see other diversity groups using, like the LGBT. But why not be really proud of who we are and who our children are, but at the same time, we need to embrace all allies. And I'll make one more comment, which is a sort of sad comment, but once again, when they told me my daughter had Down syndrome, I didn't even know what that meant. I didn't think I'd ever met somebody with a disability. What I didn't realize, that I was surrounded by it, and I also myself have an invisible disability. But I found out later, my great-grandmother, she had epilepsy, and sadly, she had an epileptic fit, and she was beside the fireplace. She found the fireplace and burned to death. So I actually have quite a robust history of family members with disabilities. Now, does that mean something's wrong with my family line? I would absolutely say no. I think I have a diverse and beautiful family line. But
Yeah.
So tell us more about your book, Al.
Well, this last point you made around pride is what I see happening now around the world. And I'm just an observer of this among various groups of people who describe themselves as being disabled. And in fact, the younger generation doesn't even use the nomenclature person with a disability, which is what was drilled into my head. It's now disabled person for many people. But there's a pride and a confidence and a consciousness developing. And this consciousness is creating its own language, creating language to describe the experience of being a disabled person in the world, creating images and signals and symbols via artists with disabilities. And so there is I think, a blossoming, and we're about to enter what one reviewer of my book suggests is the golden age of disability. And it's not that it didn't exist before, i.e. the contributions of people with disabilities throughout history. In fact, I believe that if we wrote the history of the world and eliminated the contributions of people with disabilities, we would not recognize the world. That's how profound the impact has been. Big problem is that all of those contributions are either unrecognized or they've been attributed to other people. And so I wrote the book, to say, hey, world, wake up. to the authoritative voice and experience of people with disabilities in all aspects of life, in the areas of sexuality, in the areas of democracy and social justice, in the areas of science, in the areas of the arts, in the areas of, let's call it existential, in the areas of being human. What is the nature of being human? In all of those areas. If you're looking for advice, check out a source that's been ignored for too long and that contains a treasure chest of wisdom and experience and advice on every topic imaginable for you as a person, for your organization, or for society. So that's the book.
Wow, that's such a powerful statement. I know that a lot of my coworkers in my company have disabilities. Well, over, gosh, 85%, probably a little bit higher than that. And we're very proud of that. And one of my employees, one of my colleagues, is Lamondre Pugh, and Lamondre has a physical disability. And I said to him a couple of times, and I understood how I meant this. I said, I don't even see your disability. I don't see Rosemary's disability. And I meant it very authentically in that I see him as a complex human being. I don't just see the disability, but he has done this moment of impact that will be out in a couple of weeks that said, but I don't want you not to see my disability because that's part of who I am.
Absolutely.
And I love how the younger generations are really owning who they are. And I would ask a question of Neil, because I know that Neil has a couple of, complex disabilities himself. And I'm curious from his perspective, and he talks often about his walk on the show, but I'm not sure how much he's ever talked about how his parents helped Neil with this walk. And as you were talking, I was just curious about that aspect. As we talk about this, I just love the topic.
Yeah. So I think my walk was very different in that I came under diagnosis late in life. So I went through childhood with supportive parents, but and innate knowledge that there was something about me that was different, and and that runs in the family, and so my mother was a scholarship student and a slow reader. So, but in that period of time, they weren't talking about dyslexia. My sister was, on the borderline with dyslexia. So it's there and in the background in my family, but because I was reasonably academic and sort of engaged at school, I just ignored the fact to a certain extent. I felt that I was a bit different, but I, was doing okay, and we associated at that point in time dyslexia was a real, we still had the societal model of deficit, and therefore we're only thinking about people with severe intellectual disabilities or severe learning difficulties as being dyslexic, and not this whole sort of neurodiversity. And then again with ADHD, which I've been recently diagnosed, the assumption it would be someone twitching in the corner of the classroom, not me as a dilettante, window-gazing, romantic kind of person. So they were, absolutely supportive, but I would say they didn't really understand the issues because they weren't taught about the issues. So I think the passion for me as someone that's not a parent is actually, I still have the same desire that both of you have, which is that this is the work that I'm doing is for society. I have a personal connection with it, and I'm doing it for society because I believe it to be the right thing to do, because there are lots of people out there that haven't been lucky like me to come from a white male, middle class, privileged background where I had good education, access to learning, and all of the support that I needed to be successful. and we need to be mindful that I am coming from that position of privilege where it's made that disability and those disabilities less impactful. It's not that they haven't had any impact, but someone from a different socioeconomic background, of different ethnicity, will have had the same level of disability, but will have had that magnified through their social circumstance. And so support of parents, support networks of society are really, really important. And it's one of the things that motivates me.
Yeah. This whole issue of why are we doing this work has plagued me because, people put you up on a pedestal. And that's, first of all, it's wrong. It's not appropriate. And everybody on a pedestal has clay feet. That I know for sure throughout history. So I'm wary for that reason. But the other reason I'm wary is that if somebody said to the three of us, here is the key to a room that is full of untold treasures. There are riches there that you could never imagine. There are treasures there that will enrich your life and the life of your family and society till the end of time. You'd take the key, wouldn't you? And that's what I feel when I look out at the disability world, past, present, and future, is that it's a treasure trove of riches that have been ignored, and that, the old Ghostbusters line, who are you going to call?
Yes.
If the world's in trouble now, it's going through a rocky period. Who are you going to call? Well, I'm suggesting we pay attention to an underutilized or untapped source, people with disabilities. You got trouble in your organization with motivation, with morale, with getting new ideas on the table because things change so fastly. Who are you going to call? Disabled people. You're struggling personally with marriage, with growing old, with coming to terms with something, an illness, you or somebody you love, or et cetera, losing a job. Who are you going to call? Disabled people. There's a lot of advice and experience and acumen and untold wealth that we have ignored for too long.
Well said, well said. And I love the part when you were talking earlier about, and Neil brought this up as well, about sort of the identity and the language. And I like you, it has just been drilled in my brain about people first language, nothing about us without us, which totally still agree with. And then I start seeing the younger people with disabilities not saying, no, I don't embrace that language. It's ridiculous, and as I was talking about that example with Lamondre, he sent me the short video he did, and he said, Debra, I'm sending it specifically to you because I know that when you made that comment, I don't see your disability. He said, I know how you meant it. And so I do not want to accidentally insult you and what I'm saying. And so I watched the video, and I just thought it was so beautifully done. And I came back to him and I said, I want to learn. I always want to learn. And I don't know everything. Like you said, we do get put on pedestals. And I'm just a mom in Virginia that thinks that my daughter's pretty darn amazing. And I think your daughter's pretty amazing. And I think, can we make way for more voices? But at the same time, don't throw out the allies that are there to support us. I think part of the reasons why the community has gotten annoyed with parents is because for a while parents were the only ones with voices at the table. And so I think sometimes as society we flip back and forth, back and forth. And so it is about true identity, but having allies across the board, including people without disabilities. So I think some of the things that you've talked about to me, Al, about how some of the programs that you're going to be putting on with the music and the arts. And we recently had the blind poet Dave Steele on, and his poetry is so beautiful and is really, really touching people's lives. But I think that there's a renaissance happening. There's something really beautiful and power. And the more we own who we are, like even I think Neil, sorry to compliment you, Neil, but I think Neil, the comments that he made earlier were so beautiful as he, thanked his parents and as he comes out and really owns who he is. And because he wasn't a bad student, nobody thought to, and I was sort of the same way. I wasn't a great student in school. I was always in trouble for talking. I know that's such a big surprise. And the teacher would say, next person that says one word, and I would giggle because I would get nervous and I would get in trouble. But really exploring who we are and what it means and bringing the community together. And I know you are good friends with Dr. Caroline Casey that we love. And by the way, we forgot to mention Antonio is coming home from London, so he had a delayed flight, so couldn't join us today. But
he's hidden in the background. He's lurking at the back, but his connection's poor, so he's not wanting to disturb. But I'd like to interject a little bit before we move on, and I want to hear about the arts stuff that you're doing. But I think that this whole identity thing and language is interesting and fraught with difficulty for people around the world, because if we look at, from my perspective, in my role, I work for a multinational company, so I'm working with lots of different countries and different cultures, and the language that's used in different cultures varies too. So we go on to social media and we see young people, like Debra saying, in the UK and in Canada and in North America saying, yeah, you know what, I'm an autistic person. I'm autistic, I'm disabled. Whereas in France, we still haven't got past handicapped. In Germany, they're still using that language too, and that's perfectly socially acceptable, even amongst some of my colleagues who have these disabilities. So understanding where you are, the context of who you're talking to also affects the way that the language you use. And sometimes when you're writing for the internet, you can't have that context, or you don't know. You're talking to a much wider audience. So sometimes I think we have to be, as a community, more understanding of the fact that there are all of these nuances, and we can have this kind of middle ground between person first. Because I agree, we do want to address the person and not just see a condition. But you can say, I'm Neil. This is Neil, who is dyslexic. He has ADHD. You're affirming both things. So you're saying, yes, it's part of who I am. It's affecting my makeup, but it's not the totality. And I think I do think that is something that varies depending on the conditions. So different groups have different opinions on this.
Yeah, that's very true. And the phrase I use to describe this is that a disability is both the nature of a person's disability is both no big deal and it's the real deal. And so we live in a world where it's either or, where things seem to be polarized. We need to be pigeonholed into one thing or the other. And what's being offered to us now, and what a great lesson. You see, I think this discussion around terminology is a beautiful example of a coming together. It's a unification. It will eventually lead to a deeper understanding. And so, just think about it. How, I remember 50 plus years ago, when the second phase of the women's movement was in the ascendancy, women were essentially saying, we cannot describe our experiences as a woman in the context of language that has been developed by men in a patriarchal culture. And so we're going to take the language back, and we're going to develop our own art and our own culture and our own symbols and images, and so that we can describe more fully what it means to be a woman in a man's world. And so what a beautiful thing now to see in the disability world, that ascendancy. Hallelujah. And so, yeah, I mean, Neil, your fundamental point is stop, listen, pay attention to the language that people use, not only from country to country or culture to culture, but even within a culture. There are a range of opinions, and be as respectful as you possibly can in that regard. Because in doing so, we will learn to listen, and I think it will bring us closer together. So that's sort of the way. I mean, what a wonderful time to be in when this tumult is happening around language. I think it's a good signal.
Well said. Well said. And so what do we do now? I mean, what are the next steps? I know you have, I love what you're doing with your book and the way you're telling the story and bringing the communities together. And I know that you're supportive of Dr. Caroline Casey's work, as we are also. And we believe in the power of disability. This is what we've been talking about for 5 years on AXSChat. So we obviously believe in it.
Yeah.
But what's next? How do we help? I mean, we're helping by having you on the show, and we'll be tagging Power of Disability. But you had even talked, as you explain, answer the question now. Also, I loved what you were doing with your book in supporting nonprofits and disability persons organizations around the world that want to use this data to help with their own cultures. So
look. It won't be any surprise if anybody's looking at this through the video that I'm older, and so I'm trying to be useful by shining a light on what's happening out there, and trying to open as many doors as I can because of what ever privilege that I have, so that the folks who can tell the story in their own words do it. And so one of the things I'm doing is hosting. I don't like book launches, so we're hosting Power of Disability celebrations, and I envisage them as concerts in which musicians and singers and spoken word poets and dancers and storytellers from the world of disability come together to present a concert for their town or city. And there are ways to do that. So it's both not a disability event, as we were talking, and of course, a disability event. And so that's one of the things that I hope the book will do. I'm getting a lot of interest in using the book to tackle this thing that the three of us have been talking about, which is how slowly cultural attitudes change. And so you might have a commitment to diversity, or you might have a commitment to accessibility, but if you're not welcome, if you're not included, then we still have a long way to go. It just, so accessibility in that sense gets you in the door, and then what? And so a lot of people are saying, well, this book or these stories or these concerts or these these are potentially a way of helping employees in a government bureaucracy, in a company or corporation, or in society at large, to recognize what they may not have looked at before, what they may not have paid attention to before. So I don't know if that's answering your question or not, Deborah.
No, that was excellent because the reality is we have to keep doing it. We have to, those of us that do have privilege, we have to open the door behind us and make sure that other voices are heard, which is what we're all doing. And I know that something that you and I, Al, are very, very concerned about, as well as others. And I know Neil cares about this, and Antonio does too. But, you know, the poverty when it comes to the community of people with disabilities. And so I know that's also something that you're hoping these efforts will address. And I know we're talking about ways we can work together, but, you know, that's one reason why we wanted to have you on AXSChat, because we want to know who in the world is making a difference and really trying to make the world work better for everyone. And I think that's one reason why your work is so powerful.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, poverty is, you know, all things, everything else that we talk about, but if you're poor and you're having to scrape by every day, every second, on top of getting yourself ready for a world in which it's not accessible, then you have no time or very little time to be creative and to make your contribution. So, yeah, we created a registered disability savings plan here in Canada and changed all the welfare rules to eliminate the limits on assets that you can have and also to eliminate clawback. And all that did, I mean, it's a good start, and about $4 billion in the collective deposits of registered disability savings plans. But what it did as well was awaken Canadians to the fact that poverty and disabilities go hand in hand, and they shouldn't. And so now a group of disabled people are assembling a grassroots campaign to essentially create a guaranteed basic income for disabled people so that we can eliminate that handicap. Because if you eliminate that one, I think we're going to see a resounding voice of participation from the world of disabilities.
I agree. Yeah, go ahead.
Go on, Debra.
Well, I'll say something real quick and then pass it to you. But I agree, and I'm introducing Al to Michael Morris and some leaders from Citibank that have both in the United States been working a lot on these issues too. And so I agree, it's a huge issue. So go ahead, Neil.
So just to build upon the points that Al's made, essentially, not only were there rules and systems in place that made it really difficult for disabled people to save, but we failed to take into account the additional cost of living as a disabled person. So you've got this double whammy. You've got the fact that just doing your day-to-day stuff is likely to cost more because maybe you can't access a website where stuff is cheaper, or you've got to pay for care, or you've got to go the long way around, or you've got cabs, or all of these things that you need just to be able to participate in life. Then you couple that with the fact that you're often penalized and can't have a certain amount of savings or the benefits that you get to support you are cut. We need to be taking a holistic view of how we look at finances for disabled people to make sure that we're not unduly penalizing them for doing what we encourage everyone else to do, which is to save.
Yeah. You've been much more precise than I've been, Neil, in describing what it's almost mandatory poverty by the welfare system imposed on disabled people. And my wife and I are going to be doing some work in Denmark in March, and they want to rethink their whole social welfare system And I think that's what we need to be doing. We need to eliminate welfare police. We need to look at all the subsidies that are supposed to go to disabled people, but they go to all kinds of other people under the guise of helping people with disabilities. And we need to make sure that that money from the state, from government, goes directly into the pockets and bank accounts of disabled people, and to let them make the decisions on what they need, not defined by anybody else, but by themselves. That is the fundamental reform of the welfare system that is required. And to me, it goes hand in glove with this ascendancy of pride and with nothing about us without us, et cetera, that is happening in the disability world. We must disentangle the money in the welfare system that society thinks is going toward the best interest of disabled people. We must disentangle it from that and get it directly to disabled people.
I know Debra will have heard me bang the drum about economics for a long time now, but essentially no economy does well. Oh, sorry, I'm doing the Trump thing here. No economy does well when we keep people in poverty. So by keeping people on low incomes, preventing them from earning and paying tax, we are actually reducing the GDP of the countries that we're living in. So absolutely, we need to flip the thing on its head.
Yeah. And one of the ways we can do this too, and Debra and I were talking about this on her other show, is just actually to mobilize the purchasing power that exists already in the disability world. And I'm using the term disability world, but if you were to aggregate the purchasing power of people with disabilities, their families, their parents, brothers and sisters, extended family, their friends, their lovers, their spouses, service providers, and professionals, if you were to aggregate that and then target that, I think we would awaken government and the business and corporate world to the financial power of people with disabilities. So there's a couple of things involved here that I think are really significant. One is, of course, we must see changes in the policies within our governments. But secondly, let's recognize that bold moves like that will not happen unless there is popular support. And I'm a community organizer, and popular support occurs when we organize ourselves. So for the disability world, I think that means thinking and acting like a movement. And so the many, many tributaries is the image I use, what we can do within the disability world to mobilize our economic power and make that a force that influences culture and popular media portrayals of people with disabilities, and then in turn encourages the bold political decision making that we need our politicians to make on behalf of disabled people and what they're calling for now. So we've got a job to do too, and I think that's why I really appreciate very deeply. I'm not just saying this. What you're doing, what you're both doing, because what you're doing is spreading the word, and saying to the world, let's figure out a way to unify our efforts within the disability movement and get allies outside of the disability movement, because it's all hands on deck.
Oh, absolutely. So totally agree with you on the whole piece around the value of the collective community, as does Gartner, by the way, because they estimated that market that you talked about was around $8 trillion worth.
Yeah,
it's huge. And last week we had Rick from Freeney Williams on talking about the click away pound, so talking about motivating businesses by showing them that they're losing money. We've reached the end of our allotted time, I'm afraid, but it's been really, I know, but we can carry on Twitter. So
That's right.
So I'd just like to, put in a word and say thank you to the people that keep us going every week, our supporters, so Barclays Access, Microlink, and MyClearText for keeping us going. And thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Al.